The imaginary unit, written as a lowercase I, is the number whose square is -1. That is, I squared equals -1. And I then would have to be the square root of -1. And this imaginary unit is what allows us to take square roots of negative numbers. So how we do this, right, using I notation, example A, the square root of -25, we're going to break up by the product rule into the square root of 25 times the square root of -1. Because once we isolate the square root of -1, we know that that is I. And the square root of 25 is 5, so 5 times I is 5I. For B, we have the square root of -3, so we know that we need a square root of -1. And if you divide -3 by -1, that's +3. Because the square root of -1 is I, and, well, the square root of 3 doesn't simplify. And so remember, the radical is always the last part of the expression. So I will always be before the radical. That way we know it's not inside of the radical. For example C, there's a negative out front, so that negative is going to stay out front, of course. And then the square root of 50 times the square root of -1. Because I know that the square root of -1 is I, but the square root of 50, I don't know. So let me simplify that. 50 is 5 times 10. Oh, okay, so we do have a square root of 25 here, which is 5. This 2 stays inside. And there's a negative out front. Still, not losing that. All right, so let me write this in the proper order. Negative first, number, I, and then radical. So that will be the simplified expression using I notation. Recall that the product rule for multiplying radicals, the square root of A times the square root of B, is the square root of A times B. You can put these factors together under the same radical. You can split them apart. Either way, depending on what we need to do to simplify. The question here, though, is does the product rule work for roots of negative numbers? Maybe this is hard to figure out. So let's see how it looks in an example. Multiply or divide as indicated. So for example A, the square root of -3 times the square root of -7. So if I were to use the product rule, that says I could multiply -3 times -7 under the same radical, which is the square root of 21. Doesn't simplify. So let's see what happens without the product rule. Okay, so the square root of -3 is the square root of -1 times the square root of 3. And the square root of -7 is the square root of -1 times the square root of 7. Because I know that the square root of -1 is I. And the square root of 3 and the square root of 7, they don't simplify. So outside of radical, I have I times I, so that's I squared. Inside radical, I have 3 times 7, so 21, doesn't simplify. And I squared, remember, is -1. So that means this would be the negative of square root 21. And is that the same as what we got from the product rule? No. So this product rule does not work. No, you can't use with square roots of negatives. It just doesn't work that way because we'll be off by a sign here. So we will just simplify without the product rule. For B then, we have the square root of 25 times the square root of -1. We want to break that up. And the square root of -1. So the square root of negative 1, those are both I. And the square root of 25 is 5. So really, we've got 5 times I squared. And since I squared is negative 1, that's 5 times negative 1, which is negative 5 for this expression.